Hello everyone, welcome to another GCSE History exam technique presentation. We're going to have a quick look at 4-mark describe questions today. The topic we're going to be looking at is the Elizabethan religious settlement. So here's how paper 2 is going to start for us with the Elizabeth section. We're going to get a 4-mark question, starting with the phrase describe 2 features of, and then we'll be given a topic. The techniques that we're going to look at we can transfer to question 1 on paper 1 of the historic environment section. So that was, for us, it's the work on the trenches. So here's our question that we're going to focus on. Describe 2 features of, and then our topic of Elizabeth's religious settlement, 1559, and that's for 4 marks. So before we start on our question, let's quickly recap the topic, and let's look firstly at the context of Elizabeth's religious settlement. So in 1558, when Elizabeth took the throne, England was a Catholic country. Elizabeth had taken over from her half-sister Mary, who had led England back into the Catholic Church. So when Elizabeth became Queen, the Pope was in charge of the country, services were in Latin, priests were wearing vestments, those are special robes, and churches were full of images. Elizabeth also inherited a lineup of Catholic bishops that had been appointed by Mary. Also, in the House of Lords, these bishops would sit, but also there were some lords and nobles who were also Catholic too. So she's got a lot of potential opposition. In Mary's reign, there had been harsh heresy laws. Mary, of course, was famous for burning hundreds of Protestants for going against her teachings. And again, Elizabeth would have to deal with a country that had come through a period of quite intense religious discord and disharmony. When she took the throne, she took over the throne as a relatively young female, and that would give her issues with placing herself at the head of a church in a time where it was considered that the natural position would be for men to be in charge. And she would also have to deal with Puritans. Now these were extreme Protestants. There weren't many of them, the numbers were fairly small, but their influence was very strong. And the Puritans rejected any idea that a queen or a king had the right to manage or control a church. So there was potential opposition there as well for what she was about to change. So Elizabeth's religious settlement has certain key features about it. In short, it was moderate and it was consensual, so it tried to bring in as many people in the country as possible. There are some reasons for this. Firstly, Elizabeth herself was moderate. She was Protestant, but she wasn't extreme. And as Queen of the country, it would be fitting if the religion were to reflect her own views. So she's a moderate Protestant, so her settlement is moderate Protestant as well. Now, as we've just said with our context, she's not in a particularly strong position when she took the throne. She has potential opposition in Parliament, from bishops and lords, and so any deal that she would make would have to try to limit potential opposition. And thirdly, the settlement was quite moderate because Elizabeth was keen to end the disharmony and the horrors of Mary's reign of people being burned for their religion. So though the settlement was going to be enforced, it would only be enforced financially with some quite moderate fines to start off with. There were 2 main sections of the religious settlement for us to be aware of. We could go into a lot of detail, but we're going to limit ourselves to just 3 features of both of them. So our first section will be the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which established Elizabeth's right to be in control of the church. So we can look firstly at the fact that she gave herself the title of governor of the church. She didn't take the title of head of the church as Henry VIII had done. This is a lesser title. This is linked to the fact that she was a female, relatively young, and was looking to limit any potential opposition from Catholics. With Elizabeth establishing herself as governor rather than head, they could still tell themselves that it was the Pope who was the real true head of the church. So Elizabeth takes this lesser title of governor. The Act of Supremacy, though, was enforced with oath-taking. All clergy and government officials had to swear acceptance of Elizabeth as governor of the church. Lots of leading Catholics refused to do this, particularly of the bishops. Nearly all of them left the church at this point, all bar one. Now that's quite useful for Elizabeth in some ways because it allows her to establish her own team of bishops. And just while we're on the topic of bishops, Elizabeth retained the idea that bishops would organise the church for her. There's a hierarchy with Elizabeth at the top, followed by archbishops and then bishops. It's worth noting that this would anger the more extreme Protestants, who didn't agree with this way of organising religion. They thought that everybody was equal before God, and that wasn't right. Our second wing of the religious settlement was the Act of Uniformity. Now this established what would be going on in the churches. And again, we're just going to limit ourselves to 3 sections here. There's much more that we could talk about, but we'll limit ourselves to 3 fairly straightforward aspects. Firstly, the churches would be really heavily decorated. They would be lavish. They would represent the glory of God through gold, stained glass and beautiful interiors. This again was at odds with what Puritans would want, but it would be definitely something that would go down well with Catholics and a lot of moderate Protestants too. Secondly, the language of the church would be English. It would use an English Bible, and services from the prayer book would be in English too. This is something that was popular with most people. And lastly, vestments. Again, these are the robes that priests wore, and Elizabeth decided that her priests would be wearing special robes. This is something that Puritans didn't like, and it's worth knowing about this one, just because it led to problems for Elizabeth much later in her reign, and was an issue that was returned to time and time again. Now we could go further. We could talk about some changes in terms of theology and what people believed, and what was done in terms of communion and the Mass. But we can, for the purposes of our exams, we can just limit ourselves to knowing 3 things about each aspect of the religious settlement. So let's return to our question and have a look at what we would need to do to get 4 marks here. It's really quite straightforward. All we're going to need to do is to identify one feature, and then we're going to write another sentence which is going to show some developed knowledge of that feature. So we're going to limit ourselves to just 2 sentences for each feature that we identify. And then we're going to repeat that for our second feature, and then we're going to finish. It really is as easy as that. Let's have a look at how this might have looked. So here's a top marks answer from the 2018 examination. We've got our first feature, and then we've got our second. Now you might notice that the phrasing here isn't particularly streamlined. It's a little bit clunky in places, but the exam board were okay with that. And despite the fact that this isn't particularly secure with the knowledge that's shown, this was enough to get full marks. So we really don't have to work too hard here for our 4 marks. So maybe just as a little bit of practice, what you might like to do at this point is to maybe show some developed knowledge of some of these features. Now I've listed 5 here, you could pick your own, but what might be a good idea is if you just see if you could add a further sentence to each of these, showing some further knowledge of them. In the exam, remember, we would only limit ourselves to 2, and our answer booklet will lead us to do that. Okay, we're nearly finished. If you want to take this any further, here's what you might do. On the theme of Elizabeth and religion, you might want to start to have a look at opposition to Elizabeth throughout her reign, maybe looking at opposition from two sources, from the extreme Protestants to Puritans and then the Catholics, maybe making yourselves aware of some of the key examples of opposition and when they happened. And then what you might like to do, if you've taken your study of Elizabeth's religion further, is to try that explain question you can see. Explain why Elizabeth's treatment of Catholics became harsher during her reign. Okay, that's the end. Thanks for watching. There are more videos for you to have a look at in preparation for your exams on the CHSG History channel.